Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to the Ubiquity University course on the great books, where every month we take a 90-minute session and we delve into one of the books that is considered great and discuss it and ponder the issues that are derived from its reading. I want to welcome Dr. Szabo, my colleague, who will be moderating with me over the next year. As you know, we have one call a month, and so every trimester we deal with 2 books over 2 months each. And so over the course of 2019, we will cover 6 books. And all of you who are students know from the syllabus that you have to write papers of varying lengths, whether you're a BA student or an MA student or a PhD student. And this is a required course for everyone in the university, whether you're in the Ubiquity undergraduate program or you're in the Wisdom School, because we believe that it is important in a world that is caught up in consumerism and a high velocity technology for people to reflect deeply on issues that human beings have pondered over thousands of years. And so I want to take a few moments right at the beginning here to consider what actually constitutes a great book. There have been millions of books written. 99% of them are forgotten soon after they're written. And a number are considered interesting, but there's only literally a handful, maybe a couple hundred, that are considered great. What constitutes a great book? What differentiates the mountain from the valley in terms of literature? I would offer 3 considerations. One is a great book when it can last over time. One thinks of the I Ching out of ancient China that was already formulated 4,000 years ago and hasn't changed much in form in 4,000 years. And yet it was considered one of the classics by the Chinese civilization. And it's read today. I consider the I Ching probably my closest advisor because it's an oracle in addition to being a great work of literature. One thinks of the Bhagavad Gita out of India, or the Bible or the Quran out of the West. So a great book is a book that has the capacity to endure over time and across cultures, so that wherever you are, whoever you are, when you pick up a great book, even though it's been translated many times in the many different languages, there's something about it that moves your soul. And that leads to the second characteristic that I would offer as qualifying a great book. And that is, great books move your soul because they're dealing with issues that have to do with the essential ontology of our humanity. Great books don't deal with trivia. Great books don't deal with superficialities. Great books go to the heart of the human predicament. Let's take the Iliad, for example. How does the Iliad start? The Iliad starts, "O Muse, sing to me of the wrath of Achilles." The Iliad is not the story of the Trojan War. The Iliad takes one incident in the middle of the Trojan War, having to do with Achilles losing his mistress to King Agamemnon and the wrath that was instigated there, that led to the tragedy that befell him, befell Agamemnon, and befell many of the Greeks and the Trojans. But in that one story, Homer got to the heart of the wrath of a warrior. And every warrior who's ever lived, everyone who's taken up a weapon in combat, those of us who know war, understand the power of the Iliad and the wrath of Achilles. What it means to wrestle in your own heart and mind with vengeance and ultimately redemption. Third characteristic of a great book is that they, in and of themselves, change lives. I want you to think about that for a moment. We meet people and they change our lives. We fall in love with people. We don't like people. We get in fights with people. We have all kinds of relationships with people. But you can pick up a seemingly lifeless book. All it has is pages and script. And you can start to read those words and they grip your soul in such a powerful way that your life is immediately transformed. Let's take an example of the Bible. There's an organization called the Gideons, and you go into most hotel rooms around the United States and even in Europe and different places around the world, and you'll find a Bible. It's just sitting there. You can pick it up or not. And there are thousands of stories of people coming into their rooms late at night, depressed, or not knowing what to do, and they pick up the Bible and they open it randomly and they start to read, and their lives are changed. So a great book is a book that endures. It's a book that deals with fundamental human issues. And it's a book that changes lives and transforms hearts and minds. And that's why the Great Books course is a required course for all the students at Ubiquity. We want our students to be moved by grappling with issues that human beings like them, like me, like you, have wrestled with since the beginning of our life as a conscious species. And what we discover is there's not much new under the sun, as the book of Ecclesiastes says. The issues we grapple with were grappled with by people just about like us thousands and thousands of years ago. And that is both the predicament and the grandeur of what it means to be human. So over two lectures, I want to grapple with a great book. Not because it has endured over time, because it was just written a few years ago, but because of its penetrating insight into probably the greatest enigma in the world today, the rise and ascendancy into the White House of Donald Trump. His election came as a shock to himself, to his campaign, to the American public, and to the world. Everyone assumed that he was running for reasons unknown, but having very little to do with actually being president of the United States, possibly in the furtherance of his business interests. And then the next thing we knew, he was being inaugurated and was taking the oath of office 780 days ago. Naomi Klein, in her book, No Is Not Enough, which is the book that we're going to consider this month and next, is the first person that I have come across that has actually understood the phenomenon of Donald Trump. There have been many conjectures about him. Most have been confused because of the shocking nature of his ascendancy. Most have been deficient in terms of really analyzing what factors came together to produce his almost magnetic power over the media, over the public, over the world. And Naomi Klein cuts to the heart of who he is, why he is, and what we can do about it. So that is what I would like to explore for a few minutes today. And then we'll continue our exploration next month. Naomi Klein was born in Montreal in 1970. Her parents actually were originally Americans, and they had immigrated to Canada in 1967 as they were protesting the Vietnam War. I refused the draft just about that time and had my own struggles with the US government. I considered immigrating to Canada, but then I chose not to and went to school and carried on as a US citizen. But her parents actually went to Canada. And Naomi Klein was born in 1970. And as she's recorded in various interviews and books, she grew up pretty normal, pretty superficial, caught up in designer brands and makeup and going to the malls. And then when she was 17, and then again when she was 18, she had two traumatic experiences that fundamentally and completely changed her life. The first was her mother had a stroke. And all of a sudden, her world collapsed. She had actually had pretty uneven, tense relations with her mother, as most teenage girls do, and wasn't particularly affectionate, but all of a sudden her mother was debilitated by a stroke. And Naomi had to pay attention and realize not only that life is contingent and that we are all mortal, but in some ways there's things worse than death where you can be incapacitated and require the attention of your family and the medical community for a very long time. The very next year, she had the second trauma. There was a shooting at a polytechnic school for girls in Montreal, and 14 of the girls were shot, and another 10 were wounded. And as a teenager, Naomi Klein again was confronted by the reality of senseless mass death very close by. And those two events changed her world. She became serious. She became a journalist. She was a brilliant, brilliant writer. And in fact, I'm going to be reading portions out of her book because unlike many writers who are opaque, and you've got to study them for years, like Plato's dialogues, for example, or Aristotle's logic, or Dante's Divine Comedy. Naomi Klein writes in a brilliantly clear, incisive way. And she came to fame in 1999 in a book that she wrote called No Logo, which was an analysis of the rise of the super brands in the 1980s and 1990s. I'll be dealing with this in a few minutes because they're at the heart of her analysis of Trump. And then in 2007, she wrote a book that was equally powerful called The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, in which she analyzed the essential lethality of capitalism in its present form of neoliberalism. And we're going to be covering that in depth. We probably will touch on it today, but the way I would like to choreograph our two lectures is that I want to start first with no logo and the analysis of Trump as a brand. And then I want to talk about disaster capitalism and the kind of political economics that Trump is both articulating and effectuating as president of the United States. Because the fundamental point that Naomi Klein makes in this book, No is Not Enough, is that while it's very enticing to think of Trump as an exception to everything we know about the world, in fact, she says, Trump is not the exception. Trump is the chief exemplification of trends that have been building up and shaping Western and global culture for a very long time. And it's only when we understand that and we take it seriously that we will take the measures necessary to articulate a response that goes way beyond no. And that is, I think, the ultimate triumph of this book, is not only in its analysis of Trump in relationship to these mega trends that have actually been shaping industrial culture, but also that as progressives, as people who are seeking and working and yearning for a better world, we've got to do a lot more than just say no, because no is no longer enough. We've got to move beyond that and articulate both a positive vision of the future in a way that can unite all the different fractals that constitute the progressive movement. And we have to organize ourselves effectively enough to basically jam the brand, as she puts it, because brands can be brought down if there's enough community resistance and enough community power. So that's how I would like to organize it. I will watch my time because I know everybody alive knows about Trump, right? And so everybody on this call has some experience of Trump, some a perspective on Trump. So I'd really like to engage in some real conversation with all of you through the prism of Naomi Klein's book, but also because he's in the news every single night. And the United States is waiting breathlessly for the report of Robert Mueller about whether Donald Trump, in his rise to the presidency, engaged ultimately in treason, colluding with the Russians to manipulate the 2016 presidential election in a fraudulent criminal conspiracy to gain the presidency. And then whether, secondly, having gained the presidency illegally, he sought to obstruct justice in his firing of the FBI Director James Comey and multiple other activities in which he's tried at every juncture to block the investigation of the special prosecutor of the Justice Department of the United States. So that what we have now in the United States is a great constitutional crisis. As someone that is manifestly guilty, unfit to be president, in an alliance with the legislative branch, now only in the Senate since the Democrats have taken the House of Representatives. How this is going to play out is going to be an extraordinary drama upon which the fate of the United States as a constitutional republic will be determined. And it's not altogether clear as we talk today in January of 2019, what the outcome will be. And so the world literally waits breathlessly for how the US system of checks and balances is going to deal with a president who's effectively a strong man, a rogue element, breaking apart the very constitutional system that he violated to gain the office of the presidency. It's a very complicated time. And so we need to understand very deeply what it is that's happening, because the fate of the republic literally depends on the outcome. So let's talk about brand. And I'll refer to what Naomi Klein points out in her book, The Rise of the Super Brands. She points out that, in traditional industrial times, through the 1930s, 1940s, and 50s, brands weren't that big of a consideration. Companies produced goods. They sold their goods in the marketplace. And a company was like Ford Motor Company or Tide Soap or, Rolex watches. These were storied companies. They were known for the quality of the goods they produced. And they had a brand, but the brand was identified as a instrument of the quality of the products that they actually produced in the marketplace. And then in the 1980s, Naomi Klein points out with Apple, with Nike, with Virgin Airlines, with Starbucks, you begin to have a fundamental transformation of the American culture and the whole notion of brand. You think of Apple and the brand of think different. You think of Nike and the brand of just do it. So that what began to emerge were these companies that understood that the brand was the product. That's fundamental. The brand became the product. And what they realized is if you could get people to embrace your brand, you could charge $250, $500 for a pair of running shoes that didn't cost Nike more than $15 or $20 to build. You could charge people double for an iPhone, for a Mac. Starbucks, before Starbucks, you paid maybe 10 cents for a cup of coffee in US dollar terms. And when Starbucks created its brand of what Schultz, the founding CEO, calls Starbucks as the third place. It's not home, it's not office, It's sort of like a cafe, but it's different than a cafe, and you go hang out there. Next thing people knew, they were spending $2 or $3 for a cup of coffee. So the rise of the brands, and then the term super brand was first coined to describe Michael Jordan, the great basketball player, because he became a brand in and of himself. And then all of a sudden, there was the rise of what they called lifestyle brands. Everybody wanted to be like Michael Jordan. And there were actually people killed in Chicago over Nike tennis shoes, running shoes. That's how frenzied consumers became over identifying with a brand, paying huge amounts of money, including taking a life, to participate in a concept that was being mediated as a product, so that the brand became the product. And then what happened is that the brands began to be extended. Virgin Airways began to go into wedding dresses. Starbucks began to, build CDs. Apple came out with a range of products beyond the computer, and because they realized that once you get people to buy into the brand as the product, you could then bring any kind of object into that brand, charge premiums, and people would pay the money. And then they took it a step further. If brand is the product, it doesn't matter where it's built. It doesn't matter where it's where it's fashioned and produced. And so that was the whole phenomenon in the 70s and 80s and 90s, where companies realized that they were no longer responsible for building quality products. That had nothing to do with the brand anymore. They could not only distribute the production to Malaysia or China or parts of Africa, but then they realized they don't have to produce products at all. So factories weren't just moved to the third world, factories were shut down. And what began to emerge was a very complex network of supply chains. We have no idea where an iPhone is made. We have no idea where a Nike running shoe is made. And furthermore, we don't care. We buy the iPhone because we're buying a brand. And that had two very powerful effects. And I want to read how Naomi Klein describes the effects of the rise of the super brand. She says, first of all, our culture became more and more crowded with marketing as brands searched out fresh space and new brand extensions with which to project their big ideas and reach their target markets. On the other hand, workers experienced a sharp discounting and were treated as increasingly disposable. So you have an extension of brands into more and more things, but because brands were no longer connected with the products, you could discard the workers, and you could basically evaporate the work. Brands like Nike and Adidas competed fiercely in the market sphere, and yet they manufactured their products in some of the same factories with the same workers that were stitching their shoes. They actually, Adidas and Nike would share factories while they were competing with each other at the level of brand. Head offices increasingly became campuses because they wanted to be free as possible to focus on what they considered the real business at hand, creating a corporate mythology powerful enough to project meaning onto pretty much any object simply by stamping one's brand on it. These companies were not moving their factories to North America and Europe and reopening them in Asia, but rather closing them down and never reopening them again. And as I was saying, this saw the proliferation of very complex supply chains where it became increasingly difficult to sort out where a product was being produced, by whom, where, and when. It's no secret, she says, why this model took off. If you made beautiful commercials, invested heavily in design, and tried to embody your brand identity through countless sponsorship arrangements and cross promotions, many people were willing to pay almost anything for your products. And lifestyle brands became a mania. So she asks, what does all this have to do with Donald Trump? A great deal. Trump built an empire by following this formula precisely. And then as a candidate, he figured out how to profit from the rage and despair it left behind in communities that used to do the kind of well-paid manufacturing that companies like his long ago abandoned. It's quite a con. I want everybody to just to pause here because this is at the heart of Trump. You have the emergence of brands. The idea is the product. Workers, communities, environment are considered completely negligible. This causes a lowering of wages. This disrupts communities. This has all kinds of deleterious effects, and people get mad. Trump's genius is that he took the effects of his brand, alienated humanity, spoke about their pain, and got himself elected president of the United States. It's the ultimate con. Using the problem that you created as the solution to your presidential campaign. Just think about that for a second. And let's go into Trump as brand. I just remember what he said basically two things when he was running for office. Number one, that he was too rich to be bought and that he knew how to game the system like the best of them. So he knew that the politicians were all being bought off because he had done it. He was completely open about that. And people loved it. But he said, number two, because I'm so rich and I can't be bought off, I'm the only one that can drain the swamp. You want to deal with these corrupt politicians? I know how to do that. I'm going to go in and drain the swamp. And that was basically his campaign. And then he got in, and reality then took hold. And I want to first deal with how he developed his brand. He did it, and he was the first one to create lifestyle brand in high-end real estate. Before Trump, high-end real estate was something that rich people did if you had enough money, but there was no concept of it as a brand. It was Donald Trump in the 1980s and 1990s, as Nike and Apple and Starbucks were developing their brands, that Donald Trump did the same thing with high-end real estate. And it's an extraordinary development. And he followed the trend like everybody else did that developed massive brands, and that he realized after a while, gee, I don't even have to be connected with real estate. I can just sell my brand. And he began to make even more money, not even building real estate. He would sell the Trump name. So again, didn't own anything. The other guys owned stuff, but they would pay him tens of millions of dollars to put the Trump Tower logo on the building in Singapore or Beijing or Cairo. So like the other super brands, Trump became a super brand, and he began to parlay that increasingly effectively so that he was on the cover of Time magazine. He had big interviews in Playboy magazine, and he had a famous line in Playboy magazine where he said, "Trump is the show, and it's sold out every time." And he became a media phenomenon. And because he was a genius at creating his brand. So people bought that brand and put it into the White House, basically, at a time when the opposing candidate, Hillary Clinton, had very negative branding idea and didn't understand the concept of brand, and lost the election, not only because of the collusion, but because her campaign was very ineffectual, as we all know. So I want to just move forward and again refer to Naomi Klein's writing because it's so powerful. And go now a little bit deeper, because the brand is just the superficialities. But she makes the point that she says, with every alleged ethics violation, with every brazen lie, with every deranged tweet, his administration leaves the public sphere more broken and more degraded. It's a reminder that Trump's political career would have been impossible without the degradation of the whole idea of the public sphere, which has been unfolding over decades. It could never have happened without the idea that government is not the solution, it's the problem, as Ronald Reagan famously put it. And she details how Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, subsequent to Reagan, all participated slowly in the degradation of the public sphere. And the phenomenon of brand then, as it pertains to Donald Trump, goes deeper when Trump lateralized his brand, including real estate, but also then into reality TV. And this is one of the real insights of Naomi Klein. So I want to take a moment here to explore Trump as a reality TV phenomenon, because this not only extended his brand, but brought into mass entertainment one of the most corrosive memes ever to rise in the American cultural polity. I remember that he became very doubly famous when he became the moderator of The Apprentice. And Naomi Klein makes some very important points. One is that beginning in 2000, with The Survivor, which was the first reality TV show, people began to, there was a frenzy around reality TV. And in very short order, North Americans went from deriving entertainment from scripted shows with the same reoccurring characters to watching seemingly unscripted shows where the drama came from people's willingness to eject one another from whatever simulation of reality happened to be on display. Tens of millions of viewers were glued to their sets as participants were voted off the island on Survivor, voted out of the mansion on The Bachelor, and eventually fired by Donald Trump. This is very insightful here. This was happening, sort of a Hunger Games modality of survival television programs, where only the strongest survive after basically killing everybody else off. This was happening 2 decades after the free market revolution had been kicked into high gear by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, with its veneration of greed, individualism, competition as the governing principles of society. It was now possible to peddle as mass entertainment the act of watching people turn on each other for a pot of gold. It was a kind of capitalist burlesque. With Donald Trump, the veneer was gone. The Apprentice was explicitly about the race to survive in the cutthroat jungle of late capitalism. I've never watched The Apprentice, so this came as news to me, and you folks who have watched it maybe didn't know this, but it's worth reminding ourselves that the first episode of The Apprentice began with a shot of a homeless person sleeping on the streets, a loser. Then the camera cut to Trump in his limo, living the dream, the ultimate winner. It was quite a cultural feat. After decades of mass layoffs, declining living standards, and the normalization of extremely precarious employment, what Mark Burnett, who was the producer of The Apprentice, and Donald Trump, who was the star of The Apprentice, delivered was the ultimate coup de grace. They turned the act of firing people into mass entertainment, telling viewers that by unleashing your most selfish and ruthless side, you were actually a hero, creating jobs and fueling growth. In later seasons, the underlying cruelty of the show grew even more sadistic. Losing individuals were grouped in teams that were deported to tents in the backyard of a mansion and nicknamed Trump's trailer park. The tent dwellers, whom Trump gleefully deemed the have-nots, didn't have electricity, ate off of paper plates, and slept to the sounds of howling dogs. They would peek through the gap in the hedge to see what decadent wonders the haves were enjoying. In other words, what Trump and Burnett achieved was they deliberately created a microcosm of the very real and ever-widening inequalities outside the show, the same injustices that have enraged many of the Trump voters, but they played these inequalities for kicks, turning them into a spectator sport. Think of the Colosseum in ancient Rome. That was The Apprentice. Now, the reason why this is fundamental for us to understand, and this is the genius of Naomi Klein. What's interesting about this particular piece of televised class warfare, which aired in 2007, 12 years ago, is that the pretense sold to the previous generations that capitalism was going to create the best of all possible worlds is completely absent. No, this is a system that generates a few big winners and hordes of losers. So you'd better make sure you are on the winning team. Trump's pitch was always that I will turn you into a winner. you can be like me. If you're ruthless, if you cheat, if you beat the other guy, there's no such thing as win-win in Trump's world. It is only a zero-sum game where I win and you lose. Trump first started selling the notion that he held the ticket to joining the top 1% of income earners at the precise moment when many of the ladders that provided social mobility between classes, like free quality public education, were being kicked away. The central idea and around which Trump built his brand and amassed his fortune is by selling the promise that you too can be like Donald Trump. And then it gets more bizarre when one thinks of what Trump did in addition to The Apprentice during this time of the 90s and the 2000s, is he went into the wrestling domain. And Naomi Klein, again, here is very incisive. He performed in the World Wrestling Entertainment appearances at least 8 times. Trump, as one of the fighters, enough to earn him a place in the World Wrestling Entertainment Hall of Fame. I didn't know this before reading Naomi Klein. And when he became president, he appointed the former CEO of the World Wrestling Entertainment, Linda McCohen, to his cabinet as head of the Small Business Administration. As with The Apprentice, Trump's side career in pro wrestling exposed and endeared him to a massive audience in stadiums, on TV, and online. It generates over $1 billion a year. And if you look at his presidential run, it had a distinctly pro wrestling quality, the way he called, Ted Cruz, Lying Ted, or Little Marco for Marco Rubio, or Lock Her Up, Hillary for Hillary Clinton. What happened is that they had just been, what they had been, if you went to a Trump rally, says Naomi Klein, it's as if they'd been to a bizarre cross between a pro wrestling match and a white supremacist rally. What reality TV and professional wrestling have in common is that they are forms of mass entertainment that are relatively new in American culture. And they both establish a curious relationship. Track it now. They both establish a curious relationship with reality, one that is both fake and still somehow genuine at the same time. With pro wrestling, every fight is fixed. Everybody knows that it's rehearsed. Everybody knows it's fake. But that doesn't lessen the enjoyment that we experience. The artifice of fakeness is not a drawback. It's the point. Fake news, the constant lying. It's the point. It's the point. At the same time as you're watching it, you know it's not real, so you don't have to care. You get to be part of the drama without having to feel any of the empathy. And Trump has grafted this same warped relationship to reality onto his administration. He announces that Obama wiretapped him in the same way that a wrestler declares he's going to annihilate and humiliate his opponent. And in fact, after he became president, he announced that he was going to keep his position as the executive producer of the Celebrity Apprentice. So he's still involved with the Apprentice show, with pro wrestling, as president of the United States. And what he's learned Basically, the Trump show, she says, is now broadcasting live from the Oval Office and from Mar-a-Lago, which is even more like a TV show because its well-heeled members provide a built-in live studio audience. And he edits reality to fit his narrative, just like he learned to do on The Apprentice, and just like he did on his first day as president, insisting against all objective evidence that his inauguration crowds had been the largest in history. And this is where I'll close the discussion on brand. In 1992, Naomi Klein recalls, when his empire was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, thanks to a series of bad investment decisions, he didn't deal with the situation by getting his finances in order. Instead, he threw an elaborate comeback party for his investors and financiers at the Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City, which culminated in Trump wearing satin boxing shorts and red boxing gloves, punching through a paper wall to the theme song of Rocky Balboa. The ultimate extravaganza, the ultimate fakeness, the ultimate celebrity apprentice, pro wrestling meme, embodied by Trump. And guess what? The banks gave him the money to bail him out. So that the constant lies, the braggadocio, the creation of reality is not the exception to Trump. It's the chief exemplification of Trump. And that leads to where I'll leave it, but I want to take it up next time. And that is, that has a shadow content. Because of the fakeness of it, sooner or later, that's going to collapse. But that's when Trump shows the same genius of Goebbels and Hitler and other great monstrosities of history, having used the very problems that are created by his business practice, massive layoffs, factory closings, shipping off to the third world, alienation. He takes all that anger, speaks to it, channels it. He channels the anger he himself created. And then when it begins to collapse, Trump falls back on the ultimate tools of that shadow. He doubles down on pitting white workers against immigrant workers. Look what he's doing right now about the wall in Mexico. There is no crisis on our southern wall. And yet he's asserting there's 4,000 terrorists that came over the wall in the last couple of months, which is completely delusional. He talks about black crime. He whips up absurd frenzies about transgendered peoples and bathrooms and launches fiercer attack on women and reproductive rights and on the press. So that the phenomenon of Trump, as he effectuates his brand, channeling the anger that he and other corporations have created, he then takes that anger and pits people against other vulnerable people. This is what Fox News does. It foments fear and hatred and division and hysteria by making up contradictions that don't exist in reality, but allow the people that have been victimized by the very system that took Trump into the White House to then vent their anger against those immigrants coming over the border from Central America, or against Black young men walking down the streets to want to shoot them. To engaging disparagingly with women and in all kinds of savage and dehumanizing ways. And that is the phenomenon that Trump is now embodying and is brought into the White House. And we're seeing it played out. And Naomi Klein, and this is what we'll get to next month, but I wanted to just deal with the brand issue today, is that there's a whole system of capitalism, of neoliberalism, that undergirds the creation of brand. And that in fact, the creation and the emergence of these super brands in the 1980s, 1990s, and now in the 2000s that have come to a feverish pitch, reality TV and pro wrestling, and now one of these people in the White House, is all the result of a economic and political system that over the last 50 to 75 years has been basically careening off the rails and engaging in what she calls disaster capitalism. But we'll deal with that next time. And so I'll close here and turn it over to first Georgie, and then I'd like to have as many comments from the rest of you as we can. But I just want to underscore the gravity of a man like Trump. They don't come by accident. They come because of deep, deep fissures in the polity that somehow, in a way, almost like with an animal instinct, they embody and project, manipulate, and ultimately bring a reign of destruction upon themselves and everyone else, as we all remember from the end of the Nazi era and the end of the Second World War. There's nowhere for Trump to end except in tears. And we as Americans need to understand that, and the art form that we now have to implement is how we minimize the damage, get a man like him out, ideally in prison, before the entire system collapses in a hemorrhaging of violence and destructiveness that could irreparably damage the constitutional republic we've spent nearly 250 years to build. Georgie?
Wow, thank you, Jim. Thank you so much. You're a very passionate person. We know that of you. And you have been so passionate about all the books you presented throughout the last few years. But this one, you are super passionate about. It just shines through the screen. Thank you very much for sharing this book with us. I must say that the first time, I remember last year, you shared this book with the team, that this is what you want to talk about. I just thought, oh gosh, not Trump again. Please, American politics, please. As a European, I just don't want to hear more about it. But I have to say that it is true that this is a true great book, because it really moved my soul. Yeah. And whenever I see anything about Trump or hear about it or read about it, there is one thing emerges within me, and that's disgust. As a woman, to me, he's disgusting. And I really can't understand his mantra you so rightly convey, that you can be like me. Who wants to be like him? Who wants to be like him? I don't want to be like Buddha. Buddha said that, I got enlightened so you can follow my example. But anyhow, as I was reading the book, I couldn't put it down. And as you remember, after a couple of hours of reading, I called you up and I said, Jim, we have to do something. Social activism, sacred activism, this is scaringly wonderful book, this is. I learned so much from it. And straight away, I was jotting things down on a piece of paper. And this is really a true sign of a great book. And one of the message was that I wrote down, and this harks back a few years ago when I was living in Florence, Italy, and we were having a wonderful Italian dinner, and we were talking about Berlusconi, who was then the president. And one of my Italian friends said that, well, Berlusconi is really the sign and the symptom of our Italian society, and we deserve our president. And it was a huge discussion. And the whole dinner table was divided at who was for and against Berlusconi. It is clear to me, as Naomi Klein explains, that Trump is not just a concern of the Americans, Jim. This is everybody else. And Trump is not the one like him. There is the Hungarian president. There is the look at Erdogan and so forth. So and for me, it's interesting to see that how some of the great celebs in America, they're so much against Trump. And I think it was Robert De Niro who called Trump as a Hitler. And Hitler was the product of our society. And this is what it's so scary to read, that this is the level of consciousness of humankind, because this is what produced Trump and Hitler in the past. Also, the other thing that came to me while reading this book, that was talking to a friend of mine who is a businessman, a German businessman. He lives in Mauritius. And he works for the UN and the UNESCO. He does lots of philanthropic projects. And we're talking about Angela Merkel and Trump. And he was actually trying to convince me that Trump is a good news because he's a businessman. So he's much better than any politician. And I almost fell off my chair. Like, how can you say that? So somebody who I really termed as a person, a consciously coherent person, can say something like that Trump is actually a good news. From the system sciences point of view, he's a good news because he's pushing the whole system to a much greater velocity of decision making. From that point of view, yes, but from the other point of view, I think probably not. And there's one more thing I'd like to share that is still perplexing me, and that's the whole brand idea. And the aspect of that is more like that how people want to belong, and why the workspace and the family is not a safe and peaceful place. You want to belong and really present that it is a Dolce Gabbana, or it is a Trump, or it is something else. You want to display that belong that. And I look forward to hearing our participants' point of view on this. And I would like to contemplate on this more, because this is clearly a very significant part of that. Why do we want to belong, and what draws people to such notions such as the Trump brand? So just in a nutshell, thank you very much, Jim. I know that there are another 30 people who are waiting to be called and hear the review. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Georgie. And just to make two comments, so that we're all holding the gravity of this, Trump is not the only monstrosity out there. I mean, in Hungary, you've got Orban. They've just elected a guy, ultra right-wing Trumpist in Brazil. You've got Erdogan in Turkey. You've got the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, who brazenly killed and dismembered a journalist in the Saudi consulate just a couple of months ago in Turkey. You've got kind of right-wing fascist tendencies emerging that someone like Trump is actively fomenting. So that the phenomenon that I'm describing here in the United States is a global phenomenon that happens whenever people are in pain. And so I think that's worth noting. And then secondly, and by the way, I'd like for people to, before I start calling on people, if anyone I know that Ann Baring's on the line. I'd love to have your comment, but if anyone wants to make a comment, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. But I want to comment on what Georgie was meeting, because I neglected to raise it, about community. And she makes a point, because this is at the heart of what we're going to go into next time. She says, if there's one real aspect to the festival of fakery that is the Trump presidency, it's the hunger at the heart of it, the sheer insatiability. Trump likes to talk about how he doesn't need more money. He has more than enough, yet he can't help selling his products at every opportunity, and he can't stop working every angle. He has what she calls brand personality disorder. Brand personality disorder. And it's along the following lines. That unquenchable hunger, that hollowness at the center of Trump's character, does speak to something real, to a profound emptiness at the heart of the very culture that spawned Donald Trump. The rise of the hollow brands, selling everything, owning nothing, happened over decades when the key institutions that used to provide individuals with a sense of community and shared identity were in sharp decline. It's a very important point that she's making and that you just made, Georgie. Thank you. Tightly knit neighborhoods where people looked out for one another, large workplaces that held out the promise of a job for life, space and time for ordinary people to make their own art, not just consume it, organized religion, political movements, trade unions that were grounded in face-to-face relationships, public interest media that strove to knit nations together in a common conversations. All these institutions and traditions were and are imperfect, often deeply imperfect. They left many people out, and they very often enforced an unhealthy conformity. But they did offer something we humans need for our well-being, and for which we never cease to long: community, connection, a sense of mission larger than our immediate atomized desires. This is important. These two trends, the decline of communal institution and the expansion of corporate brands in our culture, have had an inverse seesaw-like relationship to one another over the decades, as the influence of those institutions that provided us with that essential sense of belonging went down. The power of the commercial super brands went up. But it's always worth remembering that at the heart of this cycle is that very powerful force, the human longing for community and connection, which simply refuses to die. So that is just to underscore the point that you're making, Georgie, is that that's ultimately what's happening here, is a yearning for community, a breakdown in the institutions that have shaped our community, the rise of these fake super brands, which allows someone like Trump to emerge, captivating our shadow content and bringing down a rain of destruction upon us. And that's ultimately why no is not enough. We have to build true community. And that's the only way to displace Trump and bring human relations back into an equilibrium. So thank you for making that point, because that's going to be the meta theme for the next lecture, and I thought it'd be worth flagging it. So we'll get Ann Baring first, and then Linda White, and I see that Jane Church is on. We've had some correspondence over the last couple of days. Jane, I'd love to hear from you and anyone else among the students. But Ann first. Hello, Ann. Happy New Year.
Hello, Jim. Wonderful, wonderful talk. So absolutely spot on. But I think I'm 3/4 of American, and I was brought up in a school in the teenage years until I was 13, 8 to 13 in America. So I've followed very closely what's happened. And I think that the rot began to set in with the setting off the atom bomb, because this gave America the supreme position in the world. And I've noticed that successive presidents, following Truman, I think, stressed the supremacy, really, of America. And this set the competitive thing going in the culture. We all have to be the greatest. We all have to shine. We all have to be rich. We all have to be powerful. And I think this is a really corrupt, I don't know what to call it, psychopathology that spread from the thing of the bomb. And then, of course, other nations began to copy. They were competing with America. America had to be even more great. And also the phrase, God bless America, always makes me sick, because it's so inflated. And I think there's an inflation in the American psyche through no fault of their own. It simply happened, as Naomi Klein describes it, through the brand, through boasting always that we will be the greatest. We can conquer any country in the world because we have the bomb, and the greatest bomb, the more bombs than anybody except Russia. So what do you have? You have Putin following that example. You have Erdogan following that example. You have the Chinese president following, and they're all copying the brand. And also we have this man, Steve Bannon, going all around Europe, working up the right-wing, fomenting right-wing movements in Europe. And that again, he's creating a brand again. By the way, we have The Apprentice in the UK as well. It's a dreadful program. So I think that's my comment. I've just seen it growing from 1945 through successive presidents, each one worse than the other, quite frankly, not excepting Obama perhaps, but always driven by the military-industrial complex, and always driven by the need for power rather than anything else. No mention of relationship and the well-being of the American people, but we have to be the most powerful.
Yeah.
That's our logo, if you like.
Yeah, exactly.
Does that make sense to you?
It makes very, very much sense. I think the hubris,
yeah,
right,
hubris.
goes before a fall, right? And the ultimate hubris of the atomic bomb and having ultimate power and using that to foment an arms race and aggressiveness all over the world, rather than using it as a caution to compel us to be more humble and collegial around the world. I think
now we have 5 tyrants, or instead of just one Trump, we've got 5.
Yeah, and Iran is going to probably be the next. One way.
Anyway, thank you for inviting me in.
Yes, but thank you for that, and very much. You know, in the rise of nuclear weapons and the rise of neoliberal capitalism are intertwined. The military and industrial complex is the interstices that brings the two together in a very, very dangerous way. Linda, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, when I raised my hand, so much has transpired. I hope I can cohesively put my thoughts together. But first, Jim, really deep bows to you for the synopsis that you're bringing to this. I had actually already read the book. And so when it first came out, so in rereading it, I mean, almost everything I wanted to underline, and to see where we are now compared to, you know, when the book was first published, and to see the progression is what I was really moved by. And also, I'm going to speak from the view of a PhD candidate and the Great Books Symposium. I really appreciated how you started this with what makes a great book. And as a student, you know, we've read 2 books already, and I'm trying to write the papers and link it to my dissertation. And I've been stretching, you know, to do that. And so sitting on it. And with this one, this is the heart of my dissertation. You know, I had read the book because this is what I'm passionate about in my own personal and professional quest. And so I'm just really excited that we have a community to share this. And as an American, I lived out of the country for 10 years, and coming back, what I saw, I was in shock. I still am. And leaving the country, the first thing that I experienced was the lack of exploitation. And I got curious about that because I didn't know I was exploited. And so then to come back and not picking that up has been my journey for the last 8 years. And that's really the heart of what a lot of the PhD will be about. So I'm really excited. I mean, I won't say too much more because I know there's a lot of people on the call, but it really is an honor to be part of this conversation. And
What's your dissertation on?
well, there's the threads I'm trying to pull together is transgenerational war trauma and income inequality and the symptoms that are playing out in healthcare and the opiate epidemic.
Oh,
Yeah,
oh,
so
what
there's
a rich topic.
yeah,
Oh, wow. Well done.
challenges. And that's what I was struck by. That's, I think, the most important piece I wanted to share was this time I was reading through the eyes of a student and a writer and in awe of how Naomi's research got organized into the written word and the flow, everything that you introduced us with on this call. But that was the eyes and the heart that I was reading with this time of her as a person, taking all of this in, being able to digest it and synthesize it into such a coherent, powerful book. So,
Perfect. Well, I look forward to your dissertation. I'm sure you're getting
thank you.
good conversations going with Georgie on that
Yeah,
subject.
looking forward to it.
Good. Schultz.
Hello, Mashudu is my name. I have a question. Firstly, I think I must say this was a very interesting and informative session for me. I have been watching the Trump trend, and today I think I'm getting the depth perception out of this session.
Great.
I have a comment that I wanted to make relating to a comment you made about getting rid of Trump, probably as soon as the Mueller investigation is done. And reflecting back on what happened in South Africa, we had almost 15 years of living in the so-called post-apartheid South Africa, the Mandela era, and so on. But we never really understood the underlying problems that the society had and was going through until Jacob Zuma came on the scene. And if Zuma didn't come on the scene, we would not have zeroed in on the rot that we have in our society. And I just wonder whether this is not a wake-up call for America and for the world. And perhaps the inflection point is if indeed something happens under the watch of Trump, rather than removing him, there should be some kind of explosion that happens as a result of the Trump era. And maybe that will wake up the world to the dangers of people like him, like Hitler way back then, and perhaps now we need something, I don't know. This is just a thought that crossed my mind as you were taking us through the session.
Well, thank you, Schutz. Presumably you're from South Africa. Are you speaking from South Africa today?
I am speaking from Johannesburg in South Africa, yes.
Oh, cool. And you're one of our new doctoral students.
I am interested, yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, good. I'd love to talk with you more. And just a comment, and then Jane Church wanted to make a comment, so you'll be up next, Jane. But I think you're right, and I think from referring back to what Georgie said, from a systems point of view, what's happening with Trump is he's bringing the shadow content to the surface and forcing Americans in particular, but I think the world generally, into coming to grips with issues that have been kept from public view for a very long time. You know, it's easy in the presidency of someone like a Barack Obama or a Bill Clinton to think things are better than they are because you're not really seeing the underlying contradictions. And with Trump, those underlying contradictions, there's no veneer. He's putting it right in our faces. And I think there's a direct relationship, for example, to your point, between Trump and the fact that we had more women and more diversity in the US House of Representatives as a result of the 2018 elections than any time in the history of the United States. Trump's sexism and Trump's misogyny was so stark that women have literally come out of the woodwork all over America and are running for public office and numbers and with success rates that are just unprecedented, that probably would have never happened had there not been Trump. And so I think you're really speaking to the essence of Naomi Klein's book, you know, that no is not, just saying no to this guy is not enough. You gotta get off your duff and actually run for Congress. You gotta run for the state assemblies. You've gotta get out there in the public domain and make your presence felt and your voice heard. So if there's any redeeming value to Trump, is that he's forcing Americans to come into some very hard realizations about what they have actually produced in the world and what they can now do to transform politics in America and to move forward in a much more humane way. So I think the composition of the new Congress is a beautiful response to Trump. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. And sometime I'd like to talk with you more about your analysis of what's going on with South Africa along these lines. Very
Absolutely.
important. Yeah. Jane, what is your comment?
Hello, Jim. Nice to see you. I haven't seen you since 1999 as a forum, and I enjoyed that very much.
Yes, good to see you.
I have a few different comments. One is on the commodities exchange, there's something called disaster commodities, and that's a big moneymaker and has been for decades. And it's based on probability of, you know, will this disaster take place, especially like weather wars and things like that. And so I'm very happy to hear your synopsis of the book. So we can discern what's our path ahead. Naomi seems to point out when you mentioned the fake is the point, comes back to virtual reality. I'm in the health field, and one of the things that the National Institute of Health did back around 2000 to 2002 was go on virtual reality and put their ads in there to stop STDs. So they're reaching young people where they live. So I also saw the programming on zaptoit.com that showed the movies playing lately. And I realized how many of them are simply mythological, archetypal battles and nothing more. So when people don't make that soul body ability to sense, feel, and perceive, to connect, there's great loss in what we know as being a human being. And once we discern this problem that Naomi's pointing out, then it's what are we doing about it? Like we mentioned, you've just mentioned about the uprising of women and what's happening in Congress. I look at people like AMA, AMA.org, and challengeday.com, and childrensgrove.com as being antithetical to this Trump phenomenon. We're naming him, and yes, it's a phenomenon in history that we have grown as a society. and as an economic system. And for instance, Children's Grove is a response to the Sandy Hook killings.
Yes.
And it's here in Columbia, Missouri, where I live. I was just at a meeting for developing a garden today regarding it. And it's about kindness and realizing that a single act of kindness can change a life forever. And we define kindness as respect, inclusivity, and compassion. And we're in the school systems and helping youth who've met with harm's way, and the youth in general. And when I say youth, I mean preschool through college age. There's the flagship university here and 2 colleges to help them with this concept of kindness. And there are youth kindness ambassadors inducted by the mayor every year. And we have a kindness week. It's really quite a phenomenon to be involved with. The other thing I wanted to mention is that my father worked for a chemical corporation, and as that, he was asked to work on a project that had to do with, he was told they were going to discover the nature of light. And I only learned this towards the end of his days. And he had been under a deposition by the government for the relationship of toxins and things like that put into the atmosphere by the corporation. And he was coached on what to say, et cetera, et cetera. We were at the dinner table, and he hardly ever spoke about anything, certainly not about work. And all of a sudden, you know, he said that about light, and then he looked down in a disparaged way, like he couldn't believe it, that he'd been trespassed at the person's word. And he was the person who then became head of Plant B for building the bomb that bombed Japan, head of production. And I was told my father worked in the bubblegum factory, and that he made sure that you know, there were no explosions and that kind of thing when I was a very little girl. So it's very interesting coming through this process, understanding who I am relative to my heritage and where I stand, and understanding, you know, what are we doing as a world, as an economy, and taking our place in the world through kindness. That's what I have to say, Jim.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And as the daughter of someone who participated in that great act of collective evil in a way, your emphasis and your life around goodness and kindness and compassion and gardens and so forth is a profound statement, an example that we all need to embody. Just like all the women that ran for office, you know, as they say, don't get mad, get even. And just it's a powerful thing. So Suto's comment about South Africa is a very important one. So thank you for that. And really good to see you after all these years.
Yes,
Very
indeed.
good to see you.
I agree.
And we're almost out of time, but I know Laura Madsen and John Jeanette wanted to make comments. So if you could be expeditious in your comments, that would be good. And then we can bring this to a close. Laura, first you, and then we'll have John.
Yeah, hi. Oh, this has been just so amazing. I found this book hit me like physically. I had not even heard of her before. So maybe being isolated up in Canada, but nobody's isolated. I just wanted to add that my emphasis in my doctoral thesis and dissertation is on consciousness. And, you know, I feel that we're all in this together. I feel the aspects of the shadow of this. It's why I'm drawn to Ken Wilber's work, and he's addressing similar threads to, I see a lot of his work in his latest book is also centered around the Trump phenomenon as a phenomenon in consciousness. And he calls it, he has levels of consciousness as color, and that the green edge, which was did a lot of good, started in the 60s, kind of the shadow took over, and the result is there is no higher truth. It's whatever you make it. It's like the branding, and he calls it aperspectival madness, that we're involved in. And on the other side of things is, and this is kind of what I'm dealing with, both of these levels of consciousness, the conditioned, which is where shadow can arise, and then the unconditioned, which is our spiritual potential that is pulled out of us in a crisis very often. People aren't even aware of what they're capable of standing up to unless they're under the pressure of some kind of pressure. And so one of the things that I'll just finish with is apparently in Tibetan legend, they forecast that there would be a different type of warrior coming forward in the world. And it was the Shambhala Warrior, and their weapons were compassion and discernment.
Mm.
And I hear a lot of discernment in Naomi Klein that I really appreciate, because we have to know what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your comments on all your great books that you're becoming a regular contributor. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I love it. I love this course, and yeah, it's like I found my sandbox.
Yeah. Me too. And over time, Georgie and I have been talking about, you'd be a perfect candidate, Laura. We'd like to open up the great books to, various of you students that have some book or other about which you're passionate.
Okay.
And, so that we could, just Georgie and I, of course, I love this course. This is my favorite course because the great books have been my life. But, we're trying to figure out how we can be more inclusive and broader because, there's just so much talent on this call. I mean, Anne Baring, my God. And others of you that are just doing brilliant dissertations. What Linda was talking about and yours on consciousness. Michelle Blair's doing one on the masculine. They're all fed. If you're at the doctoral level, you're all reading books, right? This is what you do when you have your doctorate. You've got to love books, or you can't do a PhD, just almost by definition. So we'd love to, have more of you involved in the books that are just gripping you, like the No is Not Enough has been gripping me lately. So thank you. John, you get the last word.
Well, greetings from Arizona.
Yeah, and it's good to see you again. We haven't talked in many, many years. It's wonderful to have you back.
It feels like I'm back in the sandbox.
You've gotten younger. You've gotten younger.
Inspired by you, but we're in a red state turning purple. So
yeah.
One of the things that's happening here, I wanted to respond to what Shute said about we not just removing Trump, but we need a kind of an explosion. And my comment was just about in part 4, where Naomi Klein talks about what happened in Argentina and the community assemblies. And I'm fired up about that because I'm doing work with story circles. And, sometimes they're called sacred circles or talking circles. But what happens is people come together. When we share our personal stories, we form a collective story. And she said in the book, all right, here's what's happening. We have to say no, and then we have to do something. And the something we need to do is to tell the other story and to be compelling about it. And so I'll just leave you with that's certainly where my avocational work is headed, and it seems like where the book is headed. So I was excited about that synergy.
I noticed Einstein over your right shoulder there. He must be an inspiration for you.
Yes, I was once in college, I was in a play called The Physicist, where I played a man who pretended to be Einstein. He was actually a spy, but in the research, I fell in love with Einstein while trying to pretend to be him.
Well, you know, your point is at the heart of what Naomi Klein is talking about in the second half of her book, that we've got to come up with a new story. And, you know, Anne Baring, Jean Houston, you know, Carolyn Mace, Andrew Harvey, all of us are how does humanity, in the face of the ruthlessness of our current story, which is about ready to destroy us, how do we go into ourselves? What depth do we have to plumb to come up with a story that is invigorating, that is global, that is empowering, and impels all of us to be the Shambhala warriors of truth, compassion, goodness, and beauty? That's the passion of my life. And that's what we're trying to do with Ubiquity.
And one of the answers she gives is to assemble.
Pardon?
One of the answers that Naomi Klein gives is to assemble.
Yeah, to assemble. And how do we do that? How do we build community? This is really, really important. So thank you for this. And I want to thank all of you for the richness of this discussion. We ought to carry this discussion forward on the Ubiquity platform. I'll send out to all the students the links so we can be continuing it. As I indicated, Georgie and I are really thinking how we can be more inclusive, so that different ones of you can speak about books that are important to you as we go along. Because this is really a graduate seminar. The Great Books is really a seminar, and I wish we were physically in a room that we could all participate in, but we have to do it virtually. So we'll continue this dialogue next time. What I want to do before we leave is I want to thank Dan Gaucher. Dan has been our tech guy for many years. He's moving on to his reward and retiring from Ubiquity. So Dan, I really want to thank you for everything. You've been impeccable in the way you've run the calls and the edits and the recordings and the archiving. And it was Dan that really, we've all moved over to the Ubiquity website now, but it was really Dan that built the website that we had for many, many years, and has been a very integral part of our team. So Dan, I just want to thank you and bid you bon voyage. And any quick comment you want to make just before we say goodbye?
Well, certainly this has been an important part of my life, and I much appreciate it. And I wish you and all of the students at Ubiquity the very best.
Thank you. And we wish everybody, all goodness to the Earth Tribe and the Earth Wisdom Academy and everything that you folks are doing. That's an example. The Earth Tribe is an example of the community that John was just talking about, and Naomi Klein believes is essential. How do we form community? How do we love one another within the context of loving the earth in the larger ecosystem in which all life breathes together? That's what we're here for. And it is out of that place that we need to understand and deal with Trump in a way, as Shuto said and Georgie said earlier, empowers community and brings into being a new story. So thank you, everyone. We will meet again in a month. And in the meantime, please be active on the group page for the great books on the Ubiquity website. Bye-bye.